Hi, this is going to be a brief summary of the sociological perspectives that we look at in the Sociology GCSE for the AQA board. Now, the way I separate these are into two categories, the big three and the little three. So the big three is comprised of functionalism, Marxism and feminism, and these are the three major theories that you absolutely need to have a good understanding of across all of the topic areas. So that's across crime and deviance, families and households, social stratification, education topic, and of course research methods. So you need to have a good understanding of feminism, functionalism and Marxism across all of the topics. Then we have the little three, which are comprised of interactionism and the new right, which you need to have some awareness of in some of the topics, predominantly crime and education, and to some extent social stratification with the new right. And then there's also postmodernism, which you're not necessarily required to have any knowledge of in order to pass the Sociology GCSE. However, for my students, I do drop some elements of postmodernism in, as it's an interesting part of modern sociology, postmodern sociology, current sociology, I should say, which, if you can draw reference to and make reference to, always goes appreciated by examiners. So postmodernism, if you don't know anything about it at all, you can still get a 9 in your GCSE Sociology. However, for general interest and wider learning around the subject, I do drop some information in. So this video will give a very brief summary of functionalism, Marxism and feminism, the big three, and then interactionism, the new right, and postmodernism. As always, if you have any questions, please pop them in the comment section below, or if I am your teacher, come and find me. The first of our theories is functionalism. Now, functionalism will probably be the first sociological perspective that you looked at when you looked at sociology. It's essentially the basis upon which all future sociology was built, to be honest. One of the first sociological perspectives and one of the major ones. So functionalism is a macro theory. Now, macro theory looks at huge institutions and big groups of people rather than looking at individual members of society. Sometimes they might be referred to as a structuralist theory because it looks at structures and institutions within society and how they interact with each other. Functionalism is also a consensus theory. That means that they view society as having created its norms and values on the basis of consensus. And this is something called value consensus within functionalism. Functionalists believe that the reason that all things in society exist is because they perform a function, and they believe in this idea of value consensus, the idea that in general people in society have shared norms and values and common goals. This is what makes functionalism a consensus theory. Some of the key ideas within functionalism are primary socialization, shared norms and values, social stability, and the analogy of the body. Now, primary socialization is simply the transmission of norms and values from parents to children, the way that children learn how to function within society, the things that are passed on from parents to children, and predominantly this is norms and values. They also believe in this idea of shared norms and values, the idea that society has a common idea about what is normal and what is important. So in general, functionalists would view most people in society as having these shared norms and values. They also focus on social stability or social order, which is how society is constructed and maintained. Functionalists believe that all of the institutions in society combine together to produce a stable and steady society. And this is further explained by the analogy of the body, which is the idea that, like a body, that has multiple organs, all performing different roles, society has multiple institutions, all performing important functions, which combine together to make a healthy and well-run society. Without one of these institutions, or without one of these organs, the body, or in the analogy, society, would become sick or potentially die. Now, obviously, there are some criticisms of functionalism. Often, functionalists overlook negative social functions of institutions. They tend to focus primarily on the positives. They may ignore the impacts of individuals. This is the case with most macro theories. They do seem to ignore the conflicts caused by some institutions, for example, religion. And you could argue that some of the ideas are outdated. For example, Durkheim, who is the founder of functionalism and one of the key writers within it, was alive sort of 1858 to 1917, so, over 100 years ago that he died. Hopefully that is a brief summary of functionalism, and we'll have a move on now to Marxism. Marxism is probably the second theory that you looked at, because Marxism can very effectively be used to evaluate or criticise functionalist ideas. So Marxism was a theory started by Karl Marx, the writings of. However, it's been expanded upon, and Marxism is much more than just what Marx spoke about. It is a macro theory similar to functionalism, and it's very interesting. A point that I make to my students is that very often functionalists and Marxists see the same thing in society, for example, primary socialization. However, they would disagree as to whether or not it's a positive thing. So functionalists tend to see the institutions in society as performing a positive role, and Marxists tend to see them as performing a negative role. They are a conflict theory, which means that they view society as structured around the conflicts between individual groups, and the groups that Marxists focus on are classes. They focus on class conflict, and they would argue that society has been purposely set up to advantage the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, and to oppress the working class, the proletariat. A couple of key ideas within Marxism are false consciousness or false conscience, ruling class ideology, the myth of meritocracy, and of course the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So false consciousness is essentially, or false consciousness is the way in which we are fooled into thinking that society is fair. So Marxists would argue that capitalism is inherently exploitative. It has to exploit us because that's the nature of capitalism. However, we've been lied to and fooled into thinking that society is fair and that capitalism is good, and this forms a false consciousness. They also talk about a concept called ruling class ideology. Now, Marx has a quote which goes something along the lines of, the ruling ideas of any age have ever been the ideas of the ruling class. And this simply means that the norms and values of the ruling class become the norms and values of society. Marxists argue that it is the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, who set the norms and values, and anything that goes against their norms and values will be considered deviant. So it is the ruling class who decide what is normal, and it is the working class who very often don't meet that expectation, so therefore are, seen as lesser. There's also this idea of the myth of meritocracy, which is the capitalist lie that if you work hard, you can be successful. Because we can see this in education. Functionalists would view this education system as meritocratic, meaning that if you work hard, you can achieve. Whereas Marxists would say there may be systemic or structural barriers in place which prevent, for example, working class students from being as successful as middle class students. You could look at things like private education. And then, of course, we have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Marx spoke about these two classes, the bourgeoisie being the ruling class, the owner class, and the proletariat being the worker class. Now, Marx saw the bourgeoisie as oppressing the proletariat, and neo-Marxists don't necessarily use the terms bourgeoisie or proletariat. They may talk about working class or ruling class, but it is this base idea that there are classes in society who are in opposition with each other, which is the very foundation of Marxism. Some criticisms of Marxism then. Marxists often overlook other social issues such as gender and ethnicity or sexuality, given that they focus so exclusively on class. Some of the studies might be dated or outdated even. Postmodern society looks very different from what Marx was talking about during the Industrial Revolution. And you could make the argument that, like any macro theory, it's very deterministic, given that there is little focus on individuals. Its focus is much more on classes and groups. So, that is Marxism. Now we shall move on to feminism. So, feminism is, again, probably the third theory you looked at, one of the final of the big three. It is, like functionalism and Marxism, it is a macro theory, which means it looks at the whole of society and it looks at huge, great groups and institutions. It is very similar to Marxism in that it is a conflict theory. However, the area of conflict that feminists focus on isn't necessarily class. It may be if you're a Marxist feminist, but it's primarily patriarchy or this idea of conflict between genders. Again, I have mentioned this to my students in class. It's important that you understand that feminism as a sociological concept is distinct from the idea of feminism that is very often spoken about on social media or in the media itself. Feminism as a sociological concept is significantly more than women just complaining about stuff, which is sometimes a very unfair characterization of feminism that you hear. So, some of the key ideas of feminism, we have, of course, patriarchy, gender norms, heteronormativity, and conjugal roles. So, patriarchy is the idea that society is structured to favour men and that men get the most benefit out of society. It's interesting to note, though, that more modern feminists might talk about men also being victims of patriarchy and patriarchal structures. But when we talk about patriarchy, what we mean is male domination of society. Feminists also talk about gender norms, which is the idea that there are specific ways that boys and girls are expected to act, and that gender is performative and is socialized into us. We are taught by our parents, predominantly, feminists would argue, and society at large, how to act as a boy and how to act as a girl. There's also a concept of heteronormativity, which is the idea that heterosexual relationships are the normal and anything else is abnormal. This is a concept which is baked into Western society, and we see it in terms like coming out. There's the expectation that a person is straight until they come out and reveal that they are, in fact, homosexual. And there is conjugal roles, which links with the family topic, and this is the idea that there are stereotypical roles associated with men and associated with women in the family. Now, feminists may talk about a move towards symmetrical families. However, it's clear to see that there are some stereotypical masculine or male and feminine or female roles within the household. Some criticisms of feminism. Often feminists ignore the successes of women in society and some of the progress that has been made in especially Western society. However, though, it does reinforce ethnocentric ideas of Western superiority. Very often feminist issues seem very much to be white women's issues rather than women's issues. See, for example, the campaigns for women to be more actively involved in the workplace. For a large portion of society, predominantly black women, they have always had to work as a result of societal pressures placed on them and racism. Feminism can also reinforce heteronormativity by focusing on this distinction between male and female, or masculine and feminine. And also you could argue that it's seen as ignoring women's agencies and power as individuals, given that it bunches them in as a demographic. So that is the big six. Sorry, it's not. It's the big three, which is the first of the six, which is feminism, Marxism, and functionalism. Next, we will move very briefly to look at interactionism, the new right, and postmodernism. So this is going to be very brief, given that these are significantly smaller theories. So, interactionism is a micro theory. This is distinct from the macro theories because it means that it looked at individual interactions between people. Interactionists would argue that meaning comes from everyday social interactions and that society is based on and constructed by these interactions. So it's not huge institutions that define us, but it is the interactions of individuals that matter. One of the key concepts within interactionism is labeling theory. The idea that, for example, nothing is inherently deviant, but a thing only becomes deviant once it is applied with the label of deviance. Take, for example, smoking cannabis. In the US, for example, there are states which it is currently legal recreationally to smoke. However, there are states where it is still illegal. So it's not the actual act of smoking cannabis that is deviant, it's the label that is applied, and that label might depend on context or situation. Another example could be being gay. It's not considered, or shouldn't be considered deviant in the UK anyway, whereas if you were to fly to another country in the world, maybe Saudi Arabia or Qatar, for example, it would be not only considered deviant, but also criminal. Then we have the new right, which is a macro theory, which is linked heavily with politics. So Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, they very heavily support capitalism and marketization. The idea that that capitalism is positive and that competition breeds success. Their key concepts are market capitalism, the underclass, which is the idea that there is a group of people below the working class who have completely dropped out of society and have no stake in society. And the concept of the culture of dependency, which suggests that if you provide benefits for people, or welfare, as you would call it in the US, that creates a culture of dependency. People become dependent on these benefits or this welfare, which means that they won't be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and be successful. And then finally, we have postmodernism, which is a theory that looks at how society has changed since the end of the 20th century, and it looks at the power of culture. The key concepts are this idea of the myth of truth, pick and mix identities, and the death of meta-narratives. So the myth of truth is essentially this idea that society can no longer be understood in terms of general theories or ideas. There's been a general loss of faith in the superiority of science and of progress. Now this links in with the idea within postmodernism, the idea is that we define ourselves by what we consume. Unlike previous theories, it focuses more on power, the power of culture, and the experiences of individuals and how they impact society. This links in very nicely with the concept of pick and mix identities, where we no longer have to fulfill identities because of class or ethnicity or gender alone. In fact, you can pick and mix between these as well as matching the diversity we see in society. So the idea is that you can take a part of your identity and focus in on that. This could be seen particularly with first generation or second generation immigrants into the UK who might refer to themselves as Jamaican despite having been born in the UK. They pick that part of their identity and that becomes part of their identity. And then we have the idea of the death of meta-narratives. So meta-narratives are theories like functionalism and Marxism, which attempt to explain the whole society from one specific perspective. And the idea of postmodernism is that's just not a reasonable thing that one is able to do. To be able to explain the entirety of society, you need to look at it in a much more granular way, looking at individual interactions, rather than trying to have this sort of one-size-fits-all interpretation. So hopefully that's enlightened you a little bit on the big three and the little three: functionalism, Marxism, feminism, interactionism, the new right, and postmodernism. If you have any questions about these things, please pop them in the comment section below. Or, as always, if I am your teacher, please come and find me.